All right, excellent. Well, thank you all so much for having me. I'm actually based in Cedar Key at the Nature Coast, and I'm excited to talk to you about my one of my passions, which is seagrass. That's what my background is in. Sorry, hold on. I've got some distractions here. I need to try to minimize this. There we go. Okay. All right, so I'm mostly going to talk about boating since I know that's what this group is interested to hear about. But first, I just want to cover a couple seagrass basics because they're going to be important for what I'm going to talk about how boating is interacting with seagrasses. So I just want to remind everyone that seagrasses are different from a lot of other plants that we see in the marine environment in that they are truly vascular plants. They're flowering plants that have a fully intact root and rhizome system. So they really depend on their roots and rhizomes to take up nutrients, and they can transport oxygen down into their root zone from their leaves. And so they're really actually pretty complex plants, and they evolved back into the ocean. So their nearest ancestors on land are lilies. So when we talk about prop scarring, which is what I'm going to get to, often I hear people say, "Oh, it's just a trim. It's just like mowing your grass and makes it grow faster." Well, it's actually more akin to like mowing your flower bed because of the evolutionary history of seagrasses. And I just put the species that we have up there. Just we have a range of different species. Turtle grass is the slowest growing, most dominant species, and then we have manatee and shoal grass, which also form meadows but are much faster growing. And so that'll come into play a little bit later. And then hopefully everybody here knows that they have vast ecological importance, not just for habitat, but for a lot of things related to nutrient cycling and carbon capture and things like that. So I don't want to belabor this, but I just want to remind you about the seagrasses themselves and the biology and their needs. Okay, so how can boating influence seagrasses? There's lots of different ways. I'm going to really focus on physical damage that we can also call scarring in this talk, but there are several other ways that we know boating can interact with seagrasses. So shading from things like mooring fields, long-term storage of vessels over top of seagrasses, docks, so we need the infrastructure for boats to drive in, dock up against, and especially in years past, a lot of seagrass has been lost through creating that infrastructure, dredging for marinas and channels and things like that. And there's also some interesting research out of the Mediterranean recently showing that noise pollution can actually impact seagrass survival and health. So it remains to be seen if that applies to our local species, but that's really interesting. But really, physical damage is what I'm gonna talk to you about. And so I just want to get on the same page about what we mean when we talk about scarring. Oh, and now that thing that I hid is now back. Oh, well. Okay, so what are scars? A lot of people think of just like that linear prop scar that you can kind of see outlined on the slide here. That's obviously from propeller contacting the seagrass meadow and actually going down into that critical root and rhizome zone and excavating a trench. But we also can get scars from things like vessel groundings when people run aground on seagrass and attempt to power off. And instead of resulting in a linear feature, that actually results in a big hole. And we call that a blowout or a blowhole. And trimming is also just when the kind of like giving it a haircut where the propeller doesn't actually penetrate down into the root and rhizome zone, but it does cut off that key photosynthetic tissue, which is how the plant gets its food, right? So it's definitely still a negative impact to the seagrasses. And then obviously anchor drags are also another one. So we kind of use scars to encompass all of these different types of ways that vessels can physically impact and remove or harm seagrass from the bottom. And so with prop scarring, I just want to give you a little bit of an idea of how, what's really the big problem with this? Okay, well, a little piece of seagrass got removed from a boat. What does that really mean? Well, unfortunately, seagrasses don't grow back as quickly as many people might think. So some of those faster growing species can recover naturally from a prop scar in as fast as 1.4 years. But in many cases, it's actually a lot longer than that. And you'll see that 10 years to recover. That's kind of out there. A lot of people know about that. number. If in the literature, it's more like 9.5. So people round up, but that's, so 1 to 10 years, best case. There's some areas like in the Florida Keys and other places that have low sediment delivery. It can actually be 60 years, or potentially they can never recover. So it's definitely possible to have a scar that would never recover naturally. And in the few cases where this has been studied, a lot of the same scars, when their aerial imagery is redone, 2 to 5 years later, you can still find between 10 and 40% of the scars. So they don't just go away on their own. And obviously, they can cause equipment damage. Anytime your boat and your equipment contacts the bottom, that's never a good thing. That's definitely risky for damaging your motor. And I really think, obviously, this is a matter of opinion, but they are kind of an unsightly reminder of human impacts to our coast. It's kind of belies like irresponsibility or just sort of a careless use of our coastal environment. So there's definitely a negative impact to the aesthetics of a lot of these resources that people want to enjoy. And they are preventable in theory, I say, because as you'll see as I move throughout this talk, there's a lot more complexity to this issue than you might think. So this is something that we should be able to intervene with, but it actually turns out to be harder to intervene with this process than you might think. Just a couple more numbers. We don't have really great statewide estimates for the amount of propeller scarring out there. Part of that is because it's really only been assessed statewide one time in 1995. And at that time, it was estimated that about 173,000 acres of seagrass in the state were scarred. And we have about 2 million acres of seagrass in the state at the time that assessment was done. And there really hasn't been a redo of this assessment ever, because it's expensive and difficult to do. But we know that boating registration, vessel registrations have really gone up a lot since 1995. And so in places that this has been studied, like in Everglades National Park, they did a study 10 years after that 1995 assessment, and they found that there was a 4 to 5 times increase in the linear feet of scarring in that 10-year period. And now that study is another 20 years old at this point. So it's really hard to get a handle on the scale of this issue, but we know it's a huge issue statewide. And according to FWC, it's the leading threat to seagrasses behind water quality issues, which we know can cause widespread die-offs of seagrasses. And that's the leading global threat to seagrasses, water quality issues. But physical damage is really a big stressor on our remaining intact seagrasses that we should try to get a handle on. And you might be thinking, well, what about restoration? We can just restore these scars, right? Well, it's really expensive to do that. In 2019, so before the inflation and everything went crazy with labor and materials, it was about $15 to $20 per linear foot to restore seagrass scars. And if you take just the scars that were mapped in Everglades National Park only in 2008, it would be, between $250 and $350 million just to restore the scars, not for the permitting and the mobilization and demobilization of the contractors and all that. So we really can't restore our way out of this issue. It can be part of the solution in places, but the rate of new scarring is such that we couldn't keep up with that, even if we had the money to address it that way. Okay, so how can we get out ahead of this problem? I've listed here the different approaches that we have to address propeller scarring, and I've done quite a lot of work with a lot of collaborators on many of these issues. Some of these we're going to be looking at in upcoming work. So I just want to walk you through each of these and some of the data that we've collected and the research that we've done. And maybe we can have some discussion in the Q&A about where we go from here. Okay, so let's start with education. I think I hear a lot of time around this issue that we just need education. If boaters just knew better, then they would do better. And look, I'm a believer in education. I'm standing here in front of you as an educator. I've dedicated my life to this, but I wanted to just kind of give the punchline away here in that education has very little effect on this issue. We've done a lot of work to measure this, and I'll show you some of that. But it's still going to be an important part of the solution. So we do need education, but we cannot stop there. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. So we have the Be Seagrass Safe website, and we've done a lot of campaigning around the state with boat ramp signage. We're up to, I think, 37 signs around the state now, which, I mean, there's a lot more than 37 boat ramps, but there's a lot of interest in this. These graphics, this program actually started in Lee County with the Florida Sea Grant down there, and it's spread statewide. We have a social media campaign and a pledge program. And in order to evaluate the effectiveness of this, because I think that's rarely done when we do education, we think, oh, great, we did education, now scarring will go down. But we've done a lot of boat ramp education, and we've done pre and post surveys with our big pushes for the educational campaigns, and collected data on boater perceptions before and after, and boater knowledge before and after. And so I'll show you some of the data from that here. And that's just really in my way. Okay. There we go. Okay. So when we do these surveys, we go up to and ask boaters, and this was all done in my region in the Nature Coast. So I just want to say maybe you have slightly different audience and a slightly different environment here, but we didn't have any difference in any of our locations where we did this within the Nature Coast region. But when we asked people how important healthy seagrass beds were to them, 95% of them said either a 4 or a 5 out of 5. People really value seagrass. If you just ask them, they say, yeah, it's really valuable to me. But then when you ask them how much of a problem do you think seagrass scarring is, it's completely split. I mean, we have just as many people saying it's not a problem at all as people who are saying it's a really big problem. And this is despite the fact that when we ask them, have you, created prop wash, churned up grass and mud, have you scarred seagrass personally, or have you run aground in the last year alone, 20% to 40% of them are basically acknowledging directly to your face when you ask them, yes, I have impacted the bottom where seagrass is in the last year. So a lot of people have personal experience with this, and then they're kind of saying, but it's not a problem, even though they really value seagrass, right? So there's definitely a disconnect here in between people's, value of seagrass, how big of an issue they think scarring is, even though they've personally scarred seagrass in a lot of cases. And then when we ask people about, reasons that they would think seagrass is important to protect, 97% of them were able to give at least one real reason why seagrass is important to the environment, and 50% of those were habitat related. So the average boater that you just walk up to at the boat ramp has a pretty good idea of what seagrass is doing out there. Of course, there's a lot more that it's doing than just habitat, but most people care the most about habitat because that relates to fish. So it's not that people don't know about the benefits of seagrass. And then when we ask about what are some problems with scarring, about 70% of people were able to come up with one issue. And again, habitat was the biggest one. But again, 30% of people said they saw zero problem with it. And then also you might think, okay, well, maybe people just don't know how to boat around shallow areas or how to boat around seagrass. But when you ask them, what would you do if you were boating in shallow water, 97% of people can say at least one correct shallow water boating behavior. So 95% of them say trim up your motor, and 75% of them said slow down. So it's not that people don't value seagrass. It's not that people don't know what seagrass does for them. And it's not that they don't know what to do around shallow water. So when you're trying to figure out a target for education, it's really hard to argue, well, there's really a big need for education. So we did this survey before and after our big social media. We did a social media campaign. We did boat ramp outreach with interns actually at the boat ramps educating people. And basically there was no change in any of these numbers. There was no change in how big of an issue people thought scarring was, no change in value of seagrass, no measurable change from education. So that was a little bit disheartening, but I think it's important to collect this data because as you move up the ladder on these options to address scarring, you start to have people say, well, we just need education. But when you have the data to say, well, education is probably part of it, but it's not going to be like this great solution that's going to solve all of our problems. So now I go back to this. Okay, and this is just showing you where we have the boat ramp signs all around the state. And I'm still a believer in Be Seagrass Safe as part of creating like this culture of not scarring seagrass over the long term. It's going to be important, but we can't stop there. So what did we try next? Navigational aids are another thing that we can do, just help boaters stay out of seagrass or realize when they're in shallow seagrass in the first place. And I really like this picture that Tom Ankerson gave me from Keith Colossal and Hernando County, Caution Seagrass area with a nice scar running right by it. So we've done some pilot studies. This is in Crystal River and Sandy Hook, one of those boating aggregation zones. There's no boaters there because this was on a weekday, but on the weekend, this will be a party sandbar type of situation. And all out here, you see this, it's a scarring hotspot in our area. So we did a study where we placed these navigational aids, and this was just an informational warning buoy. So it's not regulatory in any way. It doesn't stop you from using your motor, doesn't stop you from entering. It just gives you information. This is a shallow seagrass bank. And we looked at how people were boating around this sandbar before and after we installed the buoys. And we found that there was an immediate change, but it was only about 7 to 15% improvement in boater behavior, depending on the behavior you were observing. So things like how fast were they coming in, how far away were they slowing down, those types of things. And this is in an open access article. If you would like to read it, I think, I put the links on here. So if the slides will be shared after, you can get access to all this data. This also has all of the information about the educational campaign that we did and the findings that we had from that. I will say one bright spot about the educational campaign is that we did get some insights about audience segmentation. We found that more frequent boaters were the more likely to cause a scar. So you might think, more experienced boaters would not scar as often, but it's actually the opposite. The people that are out there more are the people that are scarring more. And that was interesting to find. And we also found out that the least experienced boaters who had also reported seeing our educational materials were the most concerned about scarring. So that's a really great entry point, especially if you're in an area where you have a lot of new boaters that are, tourists, or maybe they don't know anything about seagrass. If they're brand new and you also hit them with educational information, their concern for scarring goes right to the top of the pile. So I think that's, one of those bright spots, especially if you work with a lot of new boaters. And so I'll leave it up to you to decide whether 7 to 15% improvement in boater behavior is good enough. Not necessarily. So what about enforcement? If you have an aquatic preserve in your area, you may know that there are already existing laws against damaging seagrass within aquatic preserves, and that can come up with up to a $1,000 fine. But it is almost impossible to enforce this law. A lot of our FWC folks had to leave, but I have had conversations with them that basically say this law is not enforceable. And just to check on that, I did a public records request for all citations issued under this section of Florida law, and zero have been. There's been no ticket written under this law ever in the whole state as of 3 years ago when I did the public records request. The only seagrass damage citations in the entire state of Florida that have ever been issued have been in Monroe County in association with the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. And they have a damage assessment program where they can extract money based on the extent of the seagrass damage from the boater. But even they say that they cannot enforce like the linear scarring laws. They can only enforce vessel groundings. So when the person that is there that actually did the damage and has a big seagrass blowout is still there and they can still measure it and extract that, that's the only time that they're able to enforce. So I think enforcement would be great, but the problem is the laws that are there are so hard to enforce that it's not possible to focus on this right now. So some sort of improvement in how these cases can be made to enforce the existing laws we have. Because a lot of people point to, we already have laws protecting seagrass, but they are not working. So that's unfortunate. Another tool in the toolbox is spatial management zoning. So things like slow speed zones, anchor exclusion zones, motor exclusion zones, or even no entry zones. And zones of all of these types do exist in other waters of Florida. And in some cases, they're beloved by the fishing community because they create, these kind of silent hunt, sight fishing areas, and the fish in there are, world-renowned fish. So these types of zones are fairly unpopular, and they are also, you know, it takes a lot to get them in place. But there may be certain cases where all of these other things have been tried and aren't working, and they may be the only option. And in a lot of cases, I've actually seen the recreational fishing community, like especially the for-hire sector, has even advocated for increases in these types of zoning regulations in the Florida Keys, because they create different opportunities for them. So there's a lot of work going on this right now. And then restoration. I did say restoration is expensive, but because a lot of prop scars will not recover on their own, or won't recover on their own in decades to multiple decades, there are definitely areas, especially if they are protected with one of these spatial zoning measures, that restoration could be justified. And there's a lot of prop scar restoration that goes on in the Panhandle and down near me, and also the Florida Keys. And the reason that prop scars often don't recover on their own is because the biology of seagrasses is such that their rhizomes can grow sideways and vertically, but they can't grow down into those trenches. So unless you have a lot of sediment coming in and filling those trenches up naturally so that the roots can knit back in, you're not going to get natural recovery. So in places where we don't have enough sand coming in to refill up those trenches, you can take these cotton tubes filled with sand called sediment tubes and lay them down. In this case, it's a blowhole. They do some fill first, and then they put the sediment tubes on top. And that allows the seagrass to knit in naturally. And this was from a study that we did where we showed, you don't really need to actually plant these in most cases. Sometimes you can put a little bird stake, and that poop like fertilizes the area and causes the seagrass to grow in faster. But these are just showing that, just putting the sand in there performed just as well as when we planted them. The surrounding area stayed high, and the unrestored areas basically showed no signs of recovery after 2 years. So definitely restoration can be part of the solution. Okay, 3 minutes, no problem. All right, so I think the overall what I'm saying is that we cannot pick one of these to be the solution. We really need to have a portfolio of approaches. And I think, even though we didn't have great outcomes with the educational campaign, education is really important for helping people understand why some of these larger measures might be in place. And people are much more likely to follow rules and understand and respect rules when they understand the reasoning behind them. There's a lot of social science behind that reasoning. So if only to justify the other things that you're doing to protect seagrasses, that's reason enough alone to continue the educational campaigns. But I just don't want to see people thinking we can just do education and that be the end. So what are we doing? What are we doing more with this? We have in our region a new project called SCAR Maps that stands for Seagrass Conservation Through Actionable Research, Management Areas for Prevention of Scarring. And this is from our pilot study where we did a SCAR map update for a popular fishing area. And we see that scarring is very concentrated around certain areas and not in others. So this project will basically work with managers and the recreational fishing sector and lots of other boating groups in the area to identify region-wide throughout the aquatic preserves the scarring hotspots, and then really do an economic analysis. Ask people who are fishing, would you still fish here if it was a pole troll zone, and really help get a holistic view of the economic, the ecological, and the management implications, and get really a lot of co-production and stakeholder feedback on that. So we've been working on all of these issues this is taking like 7 years to get up to this point to lay the groundwork for this. And you can see we've got a really big team, including Tom Ankerson, who's here, but lots of folks at UF. And this was at the request of the recreational fishing sector in our area to look into this more. So more to come on that. And then lastly, what can boating groups do? I think client education, especially for people that are working with new boaters. I see some nods. We need to talk after. Yeah. And that is really an impactful audience. And there's also some really good research that verbal environmental sensitivity briefings from someone perceived as an expert, like a tour guide or a tour operator, are extremely effective in changing people's behavior. Like people touch coral less often, or they put their fins down less often when they're given a really good environmental sensitivity briefing before they go out into an environmental area. So just spending a couple extra minutes on things like that. And then also updating and furnishing good charts, maps, and warnings. And you can also implement policies in your business that you don't have to wait on some of these larger, slow-moving government processes around seagrass protection and seagrass scarring, and then supporting enforcement and management opportunities when you can. And so thank you to everyone. There's a bunch of people that helped to go into all this work, and I hope we have some time for questions. Oh yeah, and I brought a lot of goodies in the back. So please take tons of copies if you have places. You know, we've got stickers and fact sheets and all kinds of good stuff.
No time for questions.
Okay.
So thank you, Dr. Barry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just one. Okay. Oh, any questions? Get the glasses. Oh, hold on. Are you aware of the Seagrass litigation bank in St. Petersburg? And do you feel that mitigation banks are an effective way to preserve seagrass? My understanding is that seagrass is very hard to successfully artificially plant.
Yes. So I was not aware that there was a seagrass mitigation bank. I know that this is something that people have been trying to do, but I think that yeah, I mean, seagrass prop scar restoration is about the only thing that we're good at in terms of seagrass restoration. Large scale seagrass restoration really takes water quality changes in the watershed. And when you have a mitigation bank in the water, you can't really control what people are doing in the watershed. So I personally think that they are not a benefit to seagrass conservation. I think they're kind of a way to trick people into allowing more seagrass damage, and it won't actually result in no net loss.
Loading up, let's say what water quality factors are most important, this segue, for seagrass sustainment and restoration, oxygen, nutrients, etc.
Okay. Yeah, it really comes down to nutrients and anything that reduces light penetrating to the bottom. So sedimentation or algae growth, that's really going to be what's harming seagrass. They create oxygen. They don't need oxygen. So.